The first thing Hattie noticed when she walked into the Harwick engagement party was that no one had saved her a seat. Not that she'd expected one. She'd driven 4 hours from Sudbury in a car that smelled like burnt oil and fast food wrappers, wearing the only dress she owned that didn't have a visible mend in it, a navy blue wrap dress she'd bought second-hand from Value Village 3 years ago and had worn to every formal occasion since. A funeral, her cousin Breckett's graduation, now this. She'd ironed it twice that morning. The Harwick estate sat on the edge of Lake Muskoka, and from the outside it looked like something off a tourism poster. White stone, long windows catching the last of the September light, boats moored at the private dock like sleeping animals. Inside, the engagement party for her half-sister Lyndon and whatever man Lyndon had decided to marry this time was already well underway. The foyer smelled like white roses and something expensive being poured into crystal. A server walked past with a tray of champagne flutes. He didn't stop for Hattie. She grabbed one anyway. "You made it!" Lyndon appeared at the bottom of the staircase like she'd been standing there, waiting for the right audience. She was wearing something silver and backless, her hair pinned up with what looked like actual diamond clips. She was smiling at Hattie the way people smile at a stray cat that's wandered onto the porch. Not unkindly, but not like it was going to be allowed inside either. "I honestly didn't think you'd come. You sent me an invitation. I send invitations to my dentist, Hattie. Doesn't mean I expect anyone to show up." She laughed, a bright glassy sound, and 2 women standing nearby laughed with her. They were both wearing things that cost more than Hattie made in a month running the books for a mid-sized HVAC company in a strip mall on the edge of the city. "You didn't have to drive all this way. It's a family event." Lyndon tilted her head. "It's a bit of a family event, yes." Her eyes did a quick, professional sweep of Hattie's dress. Her shoes, plain black block heels, scuffed at the toe, and her handbag, which was cloth and had a broken zipper she'd safety-pinned shut. The sweep took about 2 seconds. The expression that followed it lasted longer. "There are coats in the back room if you need somewhere to put your," she gestured at the bag, "things." Hattie smiled. She'd learned how to smile through this particular feeling when she was 9 years old, so she was very good at it. "I'm fine," she said. "Where's Dad?" "Circulating." Lyndon waved a hand toward the main room, already looking past Hattie. "Don't corner him, though, okay? He's in the middle of something important tonight." She didn't explain what. She didn't need to. She'd already moved on to someone worth talking to. Hattie took a long sip of champagne and walked into the party. The main room was the kind of space that made you aware of your own body in ways you usually manage to forget. The ceiling was high enough that sound floated up and dispersed before it could get too loud. The furniture had been pushed back to make room for a loose arrangement of standing guests, clusters of people who all seemed to know each other deeply and well, who touched each other's arms when they laughed and finished each other's sentences. A string quartet in the far corner was playing something by Vivaldi that no one was listening to. Hattie found her father near the bar. Gerald Croft. She'd never managed to call him that, had called him Dad until she was old enough to understand what the title actually meant in their family, which was very little, was holding court with 3 other men in dark suits. He was in his mid-60s now, and had gotten the kind of distinguished that money made possible, silver at his temples, tan from somewhere warm and recent, watching you with the particular attention of someone who was always calculating what you were worth to him. He saw her. She knew because his expression shifted, just slightly like a door closing on a room he didn't want you to enter. "Hattie." He didn't move toward her. "I wasn't sure you'd make it. Everyone keeps saying that." She kissed his cheek because she'd come 4 hours in a burnt oil car, and she wasn't going to make it easy for him by giving up early. "Congratulations on Lyndon." "Yes, it's a good match. Very good match." He turned back to the men with him, a smooth pivot that included them in the conversation and excluded her. "Hattie's my eldest. She lives in Sudbury, does bookkeeping." The way he said bookkeeping had no malice in it. That was the part that always caught her off guard. There was never any malice. He said bookkeeping the way he'd say she collects stamps or she's between things, as a fact that didn't require further discussion, as something small and done. One of the men glanced at her politely. The other two didn't look up from their drinks. Hattie lasted 14 minutes near her father before she excused herself. She found a spot near the windows that overlooked the dock. Outside, the lake was going dark at its edges, while the middle still held onto the sky's last color. She could feel the cold coming through the glass. She pressed her fingers against it briefly, just to feel something real, and then pulled them back. Her dress was fine. It was perfectly fine. She'd ironed it twice. She was aware of Lyndon across the room, telling the story of how they'd gotten engaged, with the practiced ease of someone who'd been telling it at parties for the past 3 weeks, building to the moment her fiancé had proposed on a rooftop in Montreal, with the whole city below them like a gift. People were listening with their whole bodies. Hattie took another sip of champagne and looked out at the lake. She didn't notice the shift in the room at first. It happened the way those things sometimes do. A kind of atmospheric change, like pressure dropping before a storm, conversations faltering and then resuming at a lower register. She noticed it the way you notice a light flickering in your peripheral vision, not quite registering what it means until you turn to look. The man who had just walked in wasn't doing anything remarkable. He was simply standing at the entrance to the main room, scanning it the way you scan a spreadsheet, looking for something specific, taking inventory, moving on. He was tall and dark-suited like every other man at this party, but that's where the similarity ended. He looked like he'd been built for a different kind of room. His face had the quality of something weathered and then made sharper by it. Not handsome the way the men at this party were handsome, which was comfortable and maintained and soft around the jaw, but handsome the way a blade is functional, like every feature had earned its place there. There was a scar running from the corner of his left eye toward his ear. He wasn't trying to hide it. He was alone. No assistant trailing him, no partner, no one leaning close to whisper in his ear. Just him standing very still while the room tried to recalibrate around him. She didn't know who he was. She was about to stop paying attention to him entirely. He wasn't her business. Nothing at this party was really her business. When Lyndon detached herself from her circle of admirers and crossed the room toward him with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for this. Ronan. Lyndon's voice carried even over the string quartet. She reached him and did the social kiss, cheeks only, the European affectation she'd picked up somewhere in her 20s. "You actually came. You asked twice," he said. His voice was low and carried less than Lyndon's, but Hattie caught it. "I generally answer the second time," Lyndon laughed. "I'd like you to meet Theron, my fiancé." She gestured and a man materialized at her side, younger than Lyndon by a few years, gold watch handsome, the kind of man who had probably never been looked through in his life. "Theron, this is Ronan Vale." The name meant nothing to Hattie, but she watched Theron's face do something complicated and careful at the sound of it, the way faces do when they're trying not to show a reaction while having one very clearly. Vale shook his hand. Theron shook back. Ronan Vale's eyes moved through the room methodically and then stopped, almost without ceremony, on Hattie. She didn't look away. She'd been looked through enough times tonight that being actually seen felt strange, like being tapped on the shoulder in a dark room. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, 3, then moved on. She turned back to the window. 20 minutes later, she felt him before she heard him, the slight shift of someone stopping beside her, the warmth of another person's presence at the edge of her space. She turned, and he was there, not looking at her but at the lake, a glass of something amber in his hand. "You've been standing in the same spot for 40 minutes, he said. "I like the view." "The view is behind you." He nodded toward the room without looking at it. "The lake is fine." He said nothing for a moment. He had the quality of someone comfortable with silence, which was unusual. Most people used mass silence as a holding pattern while they figured out what to say next. This man used it like he'd decided something and was simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. "You're not enjoying this," he said. "I'm enjoying it fine. You're pressing your fingers against the glass every few minutes like you're checking if it's real." She looked at him then, fully. He was still watching the lake. Up close, the scar was more visible. It pulled slightly at the corner of his eye, gave him a permanent slight narrowing on that side that she might have mistaken for suspicion if she hadn't been watching more carefully. There were other marks, too, a faint line through one eyebrow, knuckles that had healed badly on his right hand. "What do you want?" she asked. He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were very dark and very steady. "Croft has been stealing from me for 8 months," he said, "and I think you know how to prove it." The champagne glass in her hand felt suddenly heavier. "Gerald Croft," she said, because she needed to hear herself say the full name, because calling him Dad in this context felt like something she couldn't afford. "Is my father. I know, and you think I'll—" "What? Help me find it." He said it like it was simple, which it wasn't. "The money is moving somewhere. The ledgers at his logistics company have been altered, not badly, but enough. Someone who knows numbers can find the seams." That's not a polite thing to say at an engagement party. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked back at the room. Her father was still near the bar, still holding court, still doing the smooth pivot that turned his shoulders away from anyone he'd decided didn't matter. Lyndon was laughing at something someone had said. The string quartet had moved on to Debussy. She'd driven 4 hours. She'd ironed her dress twice. She'd been asked why she'd bothered to come by her own sister, and offered the coat room as a place to put her things. "If the ledgers are altered," she said carefully, "that means someone at the company did it. Someone with access to the primary accounts. Yes, and you can't just—" She paused, choosing her words. "You can't go to your own people, because one of them is probably helping." He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. The fact that he was standing at his business associate's daughter's engagement party, talking to the bookkeeping daughter no one had saved a seat for, told her everything about how short his options had run. "How much?" she asked. "Does it matter?" "It always matters." He looked at her again with that steady, evaluating quality. 3.2 million, he said, "over 8 months, dispersed through 4 separate channels that I can see, probably more that I can't." Hattie set her champagne glass on the windowsill. Her hands were steady. She'd had a talent for going very still in moments that should have made her shake, a quality she'd developed in the offices of men who'd told her she'd made an error, and found out she hadn't. "I'm not cheap," she said. "I don't need cheap," he said. "I need accurate. And if I say no—" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the boats at the dock knocked gently against the wood, pushed by some late wave. "Then you drive back to Sudbury," he said, "and your father continues doing whatever he's decided to do with money that isn't his, and that becomes a different kind of problem." He didn't say for who. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Hattie was not afraid of him exactly. That wasn't quite the right word. It was more that she understood him, understood the particular vocabulary of a man who weighed everything on a scale that had nothing to do with sentiment, who said problem the way accountants said discrepancy, which was not a soft word at all, but sounded like one if you weren't paying attention. She was always paying attention. "I'd need access to the full ledger system," she said. "Not a copy, the source files. You'll have it, and I'll need to understand the structure of the company first. How the accounts are segmented. Who has signing authority over what? That can be arranged. If I find more than 4 channels, the rate goes up." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face. It was more like the idea of a smile, passing through and leaving a faint impression. "How much?" she told him. She said it clearly and without apology, the way she'd learned to say numbers in rooms full of men who wanted her to say them softly. He nodded once. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., I'll send the address." He reached into his jacket pocket and set a card on the windowsill beside her champagne glass. It had nothing on it but a phone number. Then he picked up his drink and walked back into the party, and by the time Hattie had turned to watch him go, he had already recalibrated himself into the room, moved to the far side, exchanged a few quiet words with someone she didn't recognize. Unhurried, unbothered, like the conversation at the window had been one of 20 he'd had tonight, and she was simply the one that had concluded satisfactorily. She looked at the card. She thought about the drive back to Sudbury, the oil smell, the safety-pinned zipper. She thought about her father saying bookkeeping in that tone of voice, looking through her the way light passes through water without stopping to consider what the water is made of. She picked up the card and put it in her dress pocket. The next morning, she found the building by following the address Vale had sent at 7:04 a.m., a text from a number she didn't have saved, to a phone she'd almost left charging on the nightstand of the motel room she'd gotten for $38 off the highway. The building was a converted warehouse in a part of Barrie that hadn't been gentrified yet, pressed between a depot and a fencing company, no signage. A man she hadn't seen before let her in without speaking. The office was on the second floor. Large windows, industrial light, furniture that was functional and expensive in a way that had nothing to do with appearances. 3 screens on the main desk, a separate table with a printer, and 3 stacked banker's boxes. Vale was already there. He was standing at the window with a coffee, jacket off, the kind of posture that said he'd been there for hours and was only now considering sitting down. He looked, in the morning light, older than she'd clocked him the night before. Not older badly, but older honestly. The tiredness in his face was the kind that came from being responsible for things that required constant attention. The kind that went to bed with you and got up with you and never quite left. "Coffee," he said, nodding at a press on the side table. "If you want it." She wanted it badly. She poured herself a cup and stood at the table with the banker's boxes. "These are the physical ledgers," she said. "A subset. The originals are digital, but these were printed at the start of each quarter and signed off on by the account controllers. I need to know if what's in these matches what's in the system." She set down her coffee and opened the first box. The numbers were clean at a glance. They always were when someone had worked hard to make them look that way. The telling thing about falsified books wasn't the numbers themselves. It was the way the numbers sat, a too even distribution across line items that should have more variance, a rounding pattern that was slightly too consistent. Small expenses sitting in categories where they had plausible deniability but didn't quite belong. She found the first anomaly 40 minutes in. She didn't say anything immediately. She kept going, noting the page, and found the second 20 minutes after that. By noon she had 7. "You have more than 4 channels," she said. She was sitting at the main desk now, the ledgers spread in front of her, with her own handwritten notes beside them. The kind she'd been making since she was 22, and running books for contractors who tried to pay their crews under the table. 7 that I can see in the physical records. The digital system will have more. There are disbursements being coded under 3 different categories that are functioning as a single channel. Whoever did this split them on purpose, spread across fiscal quarters to stay under the threshold that would flag internally. Vale had been sitting across the table. He hadn't interrupted her once in 3 hours, which she'd noted because it was unusual. Most men in his position, in any position, interrupted. They restated what you'd just said so they could hear themselves say it. He'd sat and listened like the listening itself was the job he'd shown up to do. "Can you trace where it's going?" he said. "Given access to the disbursement records and the bank reconciliations, yes." "Probably. It'll take 2 or 3 days." She paused. "Whoever did this is not stupid. They're good enough that it held up for 8 months. They just made a few choices that a very specific kind of eyes would catch, and that's the only reason you have anything to bring me." "What kind of choices?" "Habit choices." She tapped her pen against the notepad. "The way you write a 7, or always round to the nearest 50, things that are automatic. Things you do in your own books so consistently that they bleed into the false ones without you realizing it." She looked up at him. "If I find that pattern in the digital records, I can tell you exactly who it is." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the industrial windows at an angle that caught the scar by his eye and threw it into relief. "How did you end up doing this?" he said. It wasn't a dismissive question. It was the question of someone who'd been watching her work and had genuinely become curious about the answer. "Doing what?" "Books. Numbers." He paused. "You could have studied anything. This is what I'm good at." She said it simply, The way she said all true things. You could have studied something that paid better. Accounting pays well. You work for an HVAC company in Sudbury. She looked at him. He looked back. He'd done some version of a background check then. Of course he had. She would have been surprised if he hadn't. I work for an HVAC company in Sudbury, she agreed. Because 3 years ago the firm I worked at decided to let me go. Because I found an irregularity in the books and reported it to the senior partner instead of just correcting it quietly and keeping my mouth shut, and the irregularity turned out to involve the senior partner. She kept her voice level. She'd told this story before, enough times that the rawness of it had worn smooth. I was right about the numbers. I was wrong about the room. He said nothing for a moment. The numbers were right, he said. They were. Then you weren't wrong. I was wrong about what it would cost. She looked back down at the ledgers. I try not to make that kind of mistake twice. It was quiet in the office. Somewhere below them, a door closed. A truck went past on the street outside, gearing down for the light. The rate does go up, Vale said. I told you it would. I agreed to the new rate. I remember. She pulled the second ledger toward her. Then let me get back to it. He did something then that she didn't expect. He stood, picked up both their coffee cups, went to the press, and refilled them both without being asked. He set hers at the edge of the desk where it wouldn't risk the papers. It was a small thing, a practical thing. She didn't know why it caught in her chest the way it did, only that she'd been in a lot of offices in her life, and no one had ever done that. She kept her eyes on the numbers and didn't say anything. She worked until 7 that evening. By the time she packed her notes away, she had mapped 5 of the 7 channels to specific disbursement categories, cross-referenced against 2 fiscal quarters, and identified a rounding pattern in the false entries that was distinctive enough to be a signature. She hadn't identified the person yet. That would take the digital records, but she had the shape of them. She could see the outline they'd left behind, the way you can see the shape of a body in a bed from the impression it leaves after it's gone. I need the digital access tomorrow, she said, pulling on her coat. You'll have it by morning. She picked up her bag. The safety pin was still holding. She'd checked it twice that morning out of habit. Croft, Vale said. He was standing by the window again, the city behind him going to early October dark. He said the name without inflection, without warning, the way you test the weight of something before picking it up. Your father. She stopped. Yes. Does it change anything? She thought about Lyndon at the bottom of the stairs. The coat room. Bookkeeping. Said in the tone of voice a man uses for things that don't require further discussion. No, she said. He nodded just once. She left. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 4 minutes without starting it. The seat was cold. The oil smell was worse when the heater wasn't running. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and looked through the windshield at the fencing company across the street, which had already closed for the night. Its yard full of chain-link sections stacked in rows like enormous sentences that hadn't been assembled into anything yet. Then she started the car and drove back to the motel. The second day was quieter and harder. The digital system was everything the physical ledgers had hinted at, and more, a multi-layered accounts structure that had clearly been built by someone who understood how to make complexity look like organization. She worked through it with her notes beside her, backtracking twice, adjusting her channel map when 2 of the dispersal routes turned out to be feeding into a third she hadn't seen in the paper records. Vale was in and out. He took a call in the next room that she heard nothing of but the tone, low, deliberate, with long stretches of silence where he was listening. He came back and read documents at the secondary table without disturbing her. At some point he had food brought up, sandwiches from somewhere that smelled like real bread, and he set one at the edge of her workspace without commenting on it. She ate it without commenting on it either. At 3:30 she found the signature. It was in the rounding. Every false entry ended in a disbursement rounded to the nearest 25, not 50, not 125, which was unusual enough to be meaningful. The same pattern showed up in 6 of the 7 channels, distributed across 11 months of records. 11 months, not 8. Vale had been underestimating how long this had been running. She pulled up the signing authority list and went through it slowly. 3 names had access to the disbursement system with no secondary approval requirement on transactions under $20,000. 2 of them had consistent rounding patterns in their legitimate entries that she could compare against the false ones. The 3rd did not enter numbers the same way. She sat with it for a moment, looking at the name. Then she picked up her phone and went to the door of the side room. Vale looked up from his desk. "I have a name," she said. He stood. She showed him. She showed him the pattern, the channels, the timeline, 11 months, not 8, and the specific entries where the rounding gave it away. She explained it the way she always explained numbers, clearly and without decoration, because the numbers didn't need decoration. They were already telling a complete and damning story. He was very still for a long time. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain about the pattern. You'll need to confirm motive and access on your end." She paused. "But yes, I'm certain." He didn't thank her immediately. He looked at the screen for another moment, something moving behind his eyes that she couldn't read and didn't try to. Then he looked at her. "What happens to your father?" he said. "I can't control entirely." She held his gaze. "I know what he was doing. Moving the money into Croft Logistics' secondary account rather than the external channel. It's been cycling back through a family fund. A holding structure." He stopped. "Lyndon's name is on it." Hattie hadn't known that. She stood with it for a moment, Lyndon at the bottom of the stairs, the silver dress, the diamond clips, the bright glassy laugh. "She may not have known," Hattie said. "She may not have," Vale agreed. He didn't say whether he believed it. Neither did she. She closed the laptop and started organizing her notes. Her handwriting filled 4 pages. Clean columns, flagged entries, the channel map she'd drawn twice over until it was exact. The kind of work that was invisible until you needed it, which was the thing about numbers that she'd understood from the beginning and never stopped understanding. They didn't announce themselves. They waited. They accumulated. They told the truth on a long enough timeline with complete indifference to who was listening. "The rate," Vale said. "You can transfer it." She gave him the account number from memory, 7 digits and a transit, the same way she gave all numbers, clearly, in order, without repeating herself unless asked. He wrote it down. She put on her coat and picked up her bag. At the door she stopped, not quite turning around. "The people who helped him move it," she said. "On your end, I'll find them. I know you will." She meant it as a neutral observation. The numbers had already told her that much about him. The way he'd come to a stranger's engagement party, asked careful questions, waited 3 hours without interrupting, refilled her coffee without being asked. He was not a man who left loose ends unexamined. He was not a man who let anything stay in an incorrect column indefinitely. She walked out of the office and down the stairs and out into the October evening, which was cold now, genuinely cold, the kind of cold that had decided to stay. Her phone buzzed as she reached the car, a transfer notification, the full amount, including the revised rate for the additional channels, already confirmed. He'd done it while she was still on the stairs. She stood in the parking lot and looked at her phone for a long moment. Then she looked back at the building, at the second-floor windows where the lights were still on, where she could just make out the shape of him against the glass. Still at the window, as he'd been the night before. The kind of man who stood at windows the way other men paced, like stillness was its own form of motion. He was looking out, not at her, probably, at whatever the window showed him that she couldn't see from where she was standing. She got in the car. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel and thought about the last 2 days, in a way she wouldn't let herself think about later. The particular quality of being in a room with someone who paid attention, who listened like it was a form of respect, who said the numbers were right, like it was the only verdict that mattered, and also the one that had been missing for 3 years. She thought about what she'd told him. The senior partner, the firm. Being right about the numbers and wrong about the room. She thought about what he'd said back. "Then you weren't wrong." She started the car. The oil smell was still there. The safety pin on her bag held. The highway back towards Sudbury was dark and long and lit intermittently by other people's headlights coming the other way, and she drove it the way she did everything else, steadily, with attention, without looking away. Her phone buzzed again at the edge of the city. Not a transfer this time. A single line of text from the same number, the pattern in the books, the 25 rounding. You knew what that meant before you had the name. She read it once, twice. She pulled over onto the shoulder and sat in the dark with the engine idling. Yes, she typed back. I always know what the pattern means before I have the name. That's the job. She waited. 3 minutes passed. Then, I have another set of books. She looked at the message for a long time. Outside, the highway moved on without her, headlights sweeping past, each one its own direction, its own speed, its own particular errand in the dark. She thought about Sudbury, the strip mall, the HVAC company, the desk she'd sit down at Monday morning, and the numbers she'd go through with the same attention she'd brought to everything, which was absolute, and which had always been worth more than anyone had been willing to pay for it until now. She thought about Vale standing at the window with a coffee, the morning light on his face, saying, I need accurate, like it was the simplest and most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. She typed, how many channels? The response came back in under a minute. Unknown. That's why I need you. Hattie Renner sat on the shoulder of the highway with her hands in her lap, and the oil smell, and the dark outside the windows, and the number in her bank account that was the largest number that had ever appeared there. And she thought about all the rooms she'd been in, and all the rooms she'd been asked to leave, and the way numbers waited with complete patience for someone with the right kind of eyes. She put the car in drive. Send the address, she wrote. I'll be there at 9.